Imagine waking up in Tel Aviv to the sound of sirens, not warnings, but too late. The sky isn't lit by sunrise, but by fire. The streets aren't filled with commuters, but with smoke, shattered glass, and screams. For the first time in a generation, Israel, the nation built on survival, strength, and security, looked not like a fortress, but like the very places it once struck. In one night, everything changed. For the first time since its founding in 1948, Israel, often portrayed as a beacon of security and technological superiority in the Middle East, was plunged into a state of chaos and vulnerability that has rarely, if ever, defined its experience in warfare. The recent Iranian missile strike changed everything. The usual front lines disappeared as Tel Aviv, Haifa, and central Israeli cities transformed into war zones, their civilians caught in the kind of trauma and devastation more commonly associated with the Gaza Strip. Sirens blared not just in border towns but in the heart of Israeli daily life. Explosions shattered the sense of control and precision that has long been Israel's trademark response to regional threats. The Israeli home front, typically protected by a multi-layered defense system, suddenly resembled scenes from conflict zones, once confined to headlines about Gaza or Lebanon. In a matter of minutes, familiar, safe neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Apartment blocks that once overlooked the Mediterranean were torn open, exposing children's bedrooms and dining tables to the dust and fire of war. Smoke filled the skies. The streets were deserted. Panic spread, not just as a reaction to the physical threat, but because of the symbolic collapse of an identity rooted in security, readiness, and retaliation. This moment marks a significant turning point in the psychological understanding of warfare in Israel. For decades, Israelis have lived under the shadow of conflict, but rarely has that conflict penetrated so deeply into the very fabric of their most vital and civilian spaces. Bomb shelters became bedrooms, hospitals were overwhelmed, and the Iron Dome, though operational, was unable to fully protect against the sheer scale and coordination of Iran's assault. The system that once gave Israelis a crucial sense of superiority and confidence faltered, allowing missile after missile to slip through its protective net. The illusion of a perfectly defended homeland cracked. What distinguishes this moment from past episodes is the way the imagery and experience mirrored that of Gaza. Israeli citizens, many for the first time, found themselves experiencing the same terror Palestinians in Gaza have described for years. The sound of drones overhead, the fear of not knowing which building would be hit next, the helplessness of waiting in darkness as missiles streak across the sky, the brutal randomness of survival. These were no longer abstract concepts or images on foreign news channels. They became part of the Israeli lived experience. This reversal is not just tactical, it's emotional. Israelis have long viewed themselves as living under existential threat, but buffered by superior intelligence and rapid military response. That narrative collapsed in real time. The war came to their front doors, uninvited, unmanageable, and inescapable. The pain and panic that once defined the Palestinian civilian experience now found haunting echoes in Israeli cities. For once, the global community watched as Israeli civilians became the faces of suffering, broadcasting images of bloody children, burning buildings, and shell-shocked families huddled in underground garages. What makes this shift so profound is the destabilization of identity. Israel has always positioned itself as a resilient nation capable of absorbing shock while striking back harder. But this time the shock didn't come from rogue groups firing rockets from improvised launchers. It came from a state power executing a strategic, coordinated assault that revealed cracks in Israel's armor. And as the dust settled over once pristine urban centers, the uncomfortable comparison arose. This destruction, this helplessness, this chaos, it looked like Gaza, and the world noticed. In the wake of Iran's unprecedented missile barrage on Israel, a profound psychological transformation took place within the Israeli public. A shift from the mindset of control and defiance to one of fear, fragility, and raw uncertainty. What had long been a daily reality for civilians in Gaza, sirens blaring without warning, children pulled from their beds in the night, families rushing to underground shelters, buildings collapsing within seconds, suddenly became the new normal for Israelis. For many, it was not just the physical damage that stunned them, but the emotional disorientation that came with being truly vulnerable. Israelis, accustomed to military superiority and an unparalleled defense system, were not prepared for the feeling of being exposed. For decades, the Iron Dome system, surveillance networks, and preemptive strikes had allowed most citizens to believe that while conflict was ever present, it was also manageable and contained. But when Iran's missiles overwhelmed those very systems, the psychological consequences ran deep. The streets emptied in moments, not out of patriotic discipline, but raw, survivalist panic. People fled their homes without shoes, some in pajamas, dragging children and the elderly into stairwells, basements, and underground shelters. The fear was unfiltered, primal. Children who had grown up knowing war only through distant sirens and the calm reassurance of their parents were now watching those same parents tremble. Teenagers who once saw military service as a rite of passage into adulthood now questioned what strength really meant when even the strongest systems failed. The sense of national pride, so deeply tied to the belief in defense and deterrence, gave way to a different, quieter sentiment. Helplessness. Israeli citizens found themselves glued to their phones, not for news of airstrikes on enemy territory, but for updates on whether their neighborhood was next. What amplified the psychological impact was the duration and coordination of the Iranian attack. It wasn't a single missile or a symbolic act. It was a relentless, calculated wave designed to sow fear and disorder. People reported hearing multiple explosions, one after another, unsure whether it was incoming fire, interception, or direct hits. The uncertainty was total, and with the power grid temporarily compromised in some areas, nights became longer, darker, and far more terrifying. The comforting hum of modern life, electricity, internet, light, was replaced by silence, broken only by sirens and distant booms. This disorientation led to a strange inversion of roles. For decades, Israelis viewed Palestinians in Gaza through a lens of detachment, victims of their own leadership, unfortunate but far removed. But as Israelis began to experience similar trauma, loss of homes, interrupted lives, and constant anxiety, they encountered a version of reality they had long believed was someone else's burden. Conversations shifted from questions of defense policy to questions of survival. Supermarkets saw panic buying, parents discussed evacuation plans, and schools closed indefinitely, not due to policy, but fear. Fear that no system, no matter how advanced, could keep them safe. Mental health professionals across the country noted a surge in trauma responses, not just in children but in adults who had never before cried in public. Hospitals were overwhelmed not just with the injured, but with people suffering from shock, confusion, and emotional collapse. Families huddled together not only for physical protection, but emotional reassurance, trying to make sense of how their lives had changed so quickly. For a nation built on resilience and resolve, this new vulnerability left a mark. The psychological shift was irreversible, not because of the damage to buildings, but because of the damage to certainty. The feeling that Israel was impenetrable, that its people would never suffer what they saw in news clips from Gaza, was gone. The attack did not just penetrate the country's defenses, it pierced the collective psyche, leaving behind a nation that suddenly understood far too clearly what it feels like to live in fear. In the aftermath of Iran's devastating missile barrage on Israel, the global perception of the conflict in the Middle East underwent a dramatic and unsettling reversal. For decades, the visual narrative of suffering in the region has predominantly focused on the Palestinian population in Gaza, civilians living in densely packed neighborhoods, mourning lost family members, trapped between the politics of resistance and occupation. The imagery has been consistent: destroyed apartment buildings, children bleeding in hospital corridors, parents cradling lifeless bodies wrapped in white cloth. These were the images that evoked sympathy, condemnation, and debate. Israel, on the other hand, has typically been viewed as the powerful state with the ability to strike at will, armed with high-tech defense systems and strategic global alliances. That paradigm has shifted. The Iranian attack, massive in scale and unprecedented in coordination, produced a stream of images that looked eerily similar to those long associated with Gaza. Israeli civilians were filmed crying in rubble-filled streets, dragging wounded relatives and shouting for help amid burning cars and twisted steel. Apartment complexes, once considered safe havens for the middle class, were blown open. Children emerged from shelters, trembling, coated in dust and ash. In a jarring reversal, Israeli cities began to resemble war zones that the world had only ever associated with Palestinian territory. This transformation struck a chord with international audiences. News networks around the world led with footage of Israeli families displaced from their homes, clutching small children in blankets, evacuated to makeshift shelters. In a region where narratives often stick rigidly to familiar roles, Israel as defender, Gaza as victim, this shift upended expectations. Sympathy, typically limited or heavily politicized when it came to Israel, began to flow from unusual sources. Humanitarian organizations released statements not just condemning the violence, but urging support for Israeli civilians. Countries that previously criticized Israel's military conduct were now speaking about civilian trauma in Tel Aviv and Haifa, in the same tone reserved for Rafah and Khan Yunis. The emotional weight of this reversal cannot be overstated. It isn't just about media optics or diplomatic statements, it's about the way public consciousness processes conflict. The visual language of war is powerful. When people see smoke rising from buildings, when they hear a mother scream in grief, they react. And for the first time in recent memory, those visceral reactions were directed at Israeli suffering in a way that was not mediated by layers of political justification. It wasn't about Hamas or Hezbollah or strategic retaliation. It was about ordinary people caught off guard, running for their lives, covered in the debris of what used to be their homes. This sudden surge of global empathy also generated discomfort. Critics who once unilaterally defended Israel's actions were forced to acknowledge its vulnerability, while long-time advocates for Palestinian rights were confronted with a new and complex reality. Suffering is not exclusive. Pain does not recognize political borders. When the images from Gaza and Tel Aviv become indistinguishable, when the grief looks the same in every language, the old narratives begin to lose their grip. This shift in global perception is not just temporary, it challenges decades of discourse that frame the conflict in binary terms. It raises difficult questions. If both sides are bleeding, if both sets of children are hiding in basements, then what moral clarity is left? What does it mean to be a victim? What does it mean to have power? The missile strike did not only tear through buildings, it disrupted the way the world understands the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The images spoke louder than any official statement. In a matter of hours, the roles had blurred, the lines had faded, and for once, Israel looked like Gaza, not only in destruction, but in the eyes of a watching world. The Iranian missile strike on Israel marked a moment where confidence in technology, the very backbone of Israel's defense doctrine, collapsed in real time. For years, Israel's reputation as a military superpower has rested not only on its powerful offense, but on its cutting-edge defense systems, particularly the Iron Dome and the more recent David's Sling. These technologies have been touted as marvels of modern warfare, capable of neutralizing incoming threats with surgical precision and offering the Israeli population a level of protection unparalleled anywhere else in the world. For Israeli citizens, these systems were more than military tools. They were psychological safety nets, silent assurances that even in moments of tension, they would be protected. That belief was shattered when Iran launched a multi-phase missile and drone assault with overwhelming scale and coordination. The sheer volume of projectiles, dozens launched nearly simultaneously, including ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and suicide drones, was designed to saturate and bypass the layered Israeli defenses, and it worked. For the first time in decades, missiles not only made it past the Iron Dome, but landed with deadly precision in populated centers. The defense systems, built to prioritize the interception of the most dangerous threats, were stretched far beyond their capacity. In some areas, they were rendered effectively useless, allowing direct hits on critical infrastructure, residential neighborhoods, and military installations. The failure wasn't total. Many threats were still intercepted, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the symbolism of the breach. Israel had been penetrated. The myth of technological invulnerability was broken. Footage began circulating of missiles hitting apartment buildings, of fireballs erupting in the night sky without interception, of drones flying over open highways unchallenged. The silence after the explosions was louder than the sirens that preceded them. For a population conditioned to trust the effectiveness of their defense systems, this breakdown was more than a tactical setback, it was an existential shock. Military analysts began to speak not just about technical flaws, but about strategy. The Iron Dome was never built to withstand this kind of attack, multi-directional, high speed, and staggered in timing. Iran had learned from past Israeli conflicts. It understood that quantity could overwhelm quality, and that diversity in projectile types could confuse even the most advanced defense algorithms. The David's Sling, meant to deal with medium to long-range threats, engaged with some success but was similarly overwhelmed. Systems designed to be layered and seamless found themselves disjointed under pressure. The reality exposed a hard truth. Even the most sophisticated systems have limits. This exposure had political implications as well. Questions were raised domestically about preparedness. How could Israel, a nation that prides itself on constant vigilance, be caught off guard? How could billions of dollars in defense spending fail to prevent devastation in the heart of the country? Criticism was not limited to military leadership. It extended to the political class, accused of over-reliance on technology while neglecting broader strategic foresight. The public wanted answers, not just about why the attack happened, but why the systems they had believed in so deeply faltered when it mattered most. International observers too took note. Allies who once praised Israel's technological prowess now saw its vulnerability exposed on live television. The defense industry, long fueled by Israeli exports and demonstrations of success, faced uncomfortable scrutiny. If the Iron Dome could be overwhelmed, what did that mean for countries that had invested in similar systems? If a regional power like Iran could exploit those vulnerabilities, what might others learn from this? The Iranian strike didn't just test Israel's technology, it rewrote its limitations. The damage went beyond the physical, it reached into the psychological armor of a nation that believed itself shielded by science, precision, and investment. When those systems failed under the weight of a well-executed offensive, Israel faced something far more dangerous than damage: doubt. The Iranian missile strike on Israel didn't just challenge military systems or public morale, it fundamentally disrupted Israel's diplomatic standing and its regional alliances, exposing cracks in relationships that were once considered stable or even transformative. For the past several years, Israel had enjoyed a period of unprecedented normalization and outreach in the Arab world. The Abraham Accords had opened formal diplomatic ties with the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan, signaling a shift away from traditional hostilities and toward a future rooted in mutual economic benefit, shared security concerns, and quiet alignment against Iranian influence in the region. The hope was that even Saudi Arabia, the Arab world's most influential state, might soon join that list. But the Iranian assault forced many of these nations to re-evaluate not just their security calculus, but their political risk in being too closely aligned with Israel in the eyes of their own populations. Public opinion in many Arab countries has always remained deeply sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, and the sudden portrayal of Israel as a vulnerable, wounded state under heavy fire changed the dynamics. Arab states that had normalized relations or were inching toward doing so now faced an uncomfortable choice: support Israel openly and risk inflaming domestic unrest, or distance themselves and expose the fragility of their newfound partnerships. What followed was hesitation. Statements from previously warm partners became colder, more generalized. Expressions of concern came with reminders of Palestinian suffering, almost as if to restore balance in the eyes of angry publics. There was no surge of solidarity with Israel, no regional coalition forming to condemn the Iranian strike with clarity. Even nations that shared mutual distrust of Iran remained quiet or ambiguous. This lack of strong diplomatic support revealed how conditional many of these alliances truly are, rooted more in temporary geopolitical convenience than in genuine strategic alignment or cultural reconciliation. For Israel, this diplomatic silence was deafening. The state had invested years and significant political capital into building a new image of regional acceptance. It had positioned itself not only as a military power, but as a partner in trade, technology, and anti-terrorism efforts. The Iranian strike shattered that image. Suddenly, Israel was not a stabilizing partner, but a destabilized. Regional actors worried that open support for Israel might invite similar attacks or domestic backlash. Instead of rushing to stand beside it, many took a cautious step back, issuing statements of concern for all civilian lives, refusing to assign clear blame, and reaffirming their neutrality. Beyond the Arab world, Israel's traditional Western allies also reacted with an unexpected degree of caution. The United States reaffirmed its commitment to Israeli security, but even this support came with warnings about escalation and pleas for restraint. European leaders were sympathetic, but preoccupied with the potential for the conflict to spiral into a broader regional war. The international community that once rallied swiftly behind Israel in times of crisis now responded with nuance, calculation, and hesitancy. Israel had long believed that its military strength and technological edge could secure both its borders and its relationships, but the Iranian attack exposed how deeply those relationships are influenced not by strength alone, but by perception and stability. The image of Israel as a regional stronghold, the ironclad protector of its own people, and a reliable partner to others, was severely undermined. Nations across the Middle East watched as Israeli cities burned and its defenses failed, not with satisfaction necessarily, but with renewed caution. It reminded them that partnership with Israel comes with risks, and those risks, when made visible, can shift public and political will overnight. The Iranian missile strike on Israel marked not just a critical escalation in military confrontation, but a symbolic moment that altered the strategic balance of power in the Middle East. For decades, Israel maintained an image of regional superiority, militarily, technologically, and in terms of intelligence capability. It was the state that could act unilaterally, strike first, and dictate the rules of engagement. Its enemies, especially non-state actors like Hamas and Hezbollah, were seen as asymmetric threats rather than existential ones. Even Iran, despite its rhetoric, was viewed as a distant threat. Dangerous, but containable through deterrence and the unspoken red lines of proxy warfare. That perception was irrevocably changed when Iran launched a direct, coordinated strike that reached deep into Israeli territory and exposed its limits in real time. The scale and precision of the Iranian attack sent an unmistakable message. Tehran no longer felt the need to rely solely on proxies or hidden hands. Instead, it demonstrated its ability to strike directly and effectively, bypassing Israeli deterrence mechanisms and breaching its airspace with a combination of ballistic missiles, drones, and advanced projectiles. It was a display not just of firepower, but of confidence, a willingness to abandon the traditional rules of indirect confrontation and test Israel's, and by extension, the West's, threshold for escalation. The psychological impact was profound, not only within Israel, but across the broader region. It shattered the long-held assumption that a direct Iranian attack was either improbable or would be swiftly neutralized. It proved that Iran could act on its threats, and perhaps more importantly, survive the consequences. In military terms, Israel was forced into an unfamiliar position, reacting instead of dictating. The carefully constructed image of total preparedness was replaced with scenes of chaos, confusion, and vulnerability. The missile strike temporarily paralyzed Israel's airspace, caused substantial infrastructural damage, and revealed that its celebrated multi-layered defense systems were not impenetrable. That moment of tactical imbalance reshaped strategic thinking across the Middle East. Allies began to reconsider Israel's role as a security pillar, and adversaries began to re-evaluate their own capabilities. Iran had not only attacked Israel, it had challenged the entire regional order. Other state actors, particularly those aligned with Iran or sympathetic to its ideological stance, saw the strike as a proof of concept. If Israel could be hit so effectively, then perhaps the deterrence that once protected it was more illusion than reality. Hezbollah in Lebanon, militias in Iraq and Syria, and even elements in Yemen could now claim inspiration. They witnessed a scenario where Iranian resolve translated into tangible impact without immediate catastrophic retaliation. The precedent had been set. The balance of power, once tilted overwhelmingly in Israel's favor, now seemed far more fluid, uncertain, and contested. On a geopolitical level, the implications extended beyond the region. Global powers, Russia, China, the United States, watched closely, understanding that this event could redefine alliances and strategic investments. If Israel could be destabilized so rapidly, then its role as a Western outpost and regional stabilizer could no longer be taken for granted. Iran, long considered the destabilizing force, had flipped the narrative, asserting itself as a power capable of both offense and in doing so, it reshaped the power map, signaling to friends and enemies alike that the era of Israeli strategic dominance might no longer be absolute. This wasn't just about one night of explosions or a single act of aggression, it was about a recalibration of fear and respect. Iran earned a new kind of leverage, one rooted not just in ideology or proxy militancy, but in demonstrated capability. The balance of power in the Middle East, once maintained by Israel's readiness and preemptive posture, now rests on far shakier ground. The Iranian strike turned a long-standing assumption on its head that Israel could always absorb and retaliate faster, harder, and without risk to its core. That assumption no longer holds. And so, 77 years after its birth, Israel finds itself staring into a mirror it never expected. One that reflects not the might of a regional superpower, but the anguish, chaos, and vulnerability it once believed were confined to its enemies. In one night, one coordinated strike, the narrative changed. Iran didn't just launch missiles, it shattered illusions. The Iron Dome blinked. The diplomatic ties wavered. The streets of Tel Aviv echoed with the same fear that has long haunted Gaza. The world, once so confident in who was strong and who was broken, now sees the line blurred. Power is no longer protection. Technology is no longer certainty. And history, once written in absolutes, is now unfolding in shock and reversal. This isn't just about geopolitics or warfare, it's about what happens when the invincible becomes exposed, when the fortress cracks, and when a nation must reckon with the reality that it too can bleed.